Friends, before you scroll past this video, I want you to stop for one moment. Somewhere in America right now, there is a quiet priest sitting in a small room praying over a soul that is suffering in a way most of us will never understand. He does not do it for fame. He does not do it for money. He does it because he believes with every fiber of his being that there is a war happening around us, a war we cannot see, but one that is very, very real. Today, we are going to talk about that priest, a man who left behind an ordinary, comfortable life to walk into darkness so that others could walk into light. A man whose name has now reached millions of people, not because he asked for attention, because people are hungry, truly hungry for someone who will tell them the truth about good and evil. Every great story has a beginning that looks small. Nobody watching it happen would have guessed what it would become. Our story begins in Casper, Wyoming, a rugged town under wide open skies. This is where a boy named Chad Alec Ripperger was born in October of 1964. He grew up the way many boys in the American West grew up, fishing in cold rivers, hunting in quiet hills, learning patience from nature long before he learned it from books. There was nothing in his childhood that screamed future exorcist. There was no dramatic sign, no lightning bolt from heaven. Just a boy, a family, and a wide Wyoming sky. But God often works this way. He does not always call the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes he calls the quiet one, the patient one, the one who is willing to sit still long enough to listen. As Chad grew older, something inside him began to stir. A hunger not for comfort, but for truth. He pursued his studies with a seriousness that surprised those around him. He didn't just want to know facts about God. He wanted to understand God deeply, philosophically, theologically. He earned not 1 but 2 degrees in theology and in philosophy, while other young men his age were chasing very different dreams. Then came a master's degree in philosophy focused on the great mind of Thomas Aquinas, one of the deepest thinkers the church has ever produced. Then more study, then seminary. Then finally, in 1997, he was ordained a Roman Catholic priest. Think about that for a moment. Before he ever performed a single exorcism, before his name meant anything to anyone, this man had already spent over a decade of his life in disciplined, rigorous study of theology and philosophy. He was building a foundation, and when the storm eventually came, and it did come, that foundation is what held. After his ordination, his life did not become glamorous. He spent a year serving in a parish in Omaha, Nebraska. Then he was sent to teach at a seminary in Seward, Nebraska, for 4 years. Then 6 more years teaching at another seminary in Denton, Nebraska. Then 3 years as a pastor in Coeur-d'Alene, Idaho. Do you see the pattern here? Years and years of quiet, faithful, unnoticed service. No spotlight, no cameras. Just a priest doing the work God placed in front of him one day at a time. This is something we need to sit with, because in our world today, everyone wants to skip to the ending. Everyone wants the platform, the recognition, the beyond 60 moment without walking through the 20, 30, 40 years that come before it. But God does not build warriors overnight. He builds them slowly in obscurity, in the ordinary days that nobody else is watching. Then in the early 2010s, something shifted. A bishop, Bishop Edward Slattery of Tulsa, reached out and asked this priest to consider training exorcists for his diocese. For this was not something far Ripperger sought out for himself. It was placed in his path. And from that single invitation, something much larger began to grow. Eventually, he founded his own religious society, dedicated entirely to the ministry of exorcism, deliverance, and healing, a community now known as the Dollar and Fathers, based in the Archdiocese of Denver. Here is something that might surprise you. In interviews, this priest has said plainly that he never wanted this calling. He has admitted, in his own words, that even now, he still does not want to be an exorcist. Sit with that for a second. The man now known across the world as one of the most experienced deliverance priests alive did not chase this path with excitement. He was asked to walk into darkness, and he said yes anyway, not because it appealed to him, but because he believed it was what God was asking of him. This, dear friends, is the heart of true calling. It is rarely comfortable. It is rarely something we would choose for ourselves. Think of the prophet Jonah running from Nineveh because he did not want the task God gave him. Think of Moses standing before the burning bush, insisting he was not the right man for the job. Think of Mary at the Annunciation, quietly troubled, yet still answering, "Let it be done unto me." Calling is not about eagerness. It is about obedience, even when the road ahead is frightening. By the time this priest reached his 60s, he had become known throughout the Catholic world as one of the foremost living experts on spiritual warfare. Someone whose training combines rigorous Thomistic philosophy, deep theological study, and decades of hands-on experience standing face to face with what he believes to be genuine diabolic activity. His outfit, the society he founded, has been compared by outside observers to an elite special forces unit within the church, called upon for the most severe and complicated cases, the ones ordinary parish priests are not equipped to handle. Why tell you all this history? Because it matters, Before we talk about demons and deliverance, before we talk about spiritual battle, we need to understand the man behind the message. This was not a man looking for a stage. This was a scholar, a teacher, a quiet pastor for decades, who only later in life stepped into the role that would make him known to millions. And that is often how God works with the people he asks to go beyond 60, beyond the age most people expect a big calling to already be finished. He spends decades preparing them in silence. And then, when the world needs them most, he sends them out. At the core of his message is a simple but unsettling claims. There is a real spiritual battlefield around every human being every single day. Not a metaphor, not a poetic way of describing inner struggle. An actual ongoing conflict between good and evil playing out in ways most people never notice. Ask yourself honestly, when was the last time you thought about angels and demons as something real, something present, something active in your daily life? For most of us living in a modern, busy, distracted world, these concepts feel like ancient superstition or maybe something from an old horror film. But this priest teaches something very different. He teaches that the deep spiritual traditions of the church, traditions going back centuries, rooted in Scripture, rooted in the wisdom of the saints, describe a world where the unseen is just as real as the seen. He often reminds his audiences that this ministry goes far beyond what horror movies have made popular. Speaking to a packed crowd of students at a university event, He reflected that this fight demands real strength, theory, and that turning to the resources the church provides is essential in facing it. He is not selling fear, sir. He is offering a framework, a way of understanding suffering that modern secular thinking often leaves out entirely. One of the most striking parts of his teaching is about angels. Third, he describes how the presence of a guardian angel in someone's life is often felt not as something dramatic or supernatural, feeling, but as something that simply feels right, feels normal, feels like peace settling over a chaotic moment. In other words, holiness does not always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it is felt in the quiet stillness after a storm, in a moment of unexpected calm, in a decision that suddenly becomes clear when it wasn't before. But he also teaches quite seriously about the opposite force, the reality of demonic influence, and how it can manifest in forms ranging from subtle temptation to oppression to, in rare and extreme cases, possession. 30. He has spent years developing frameworks to help ordinary priests and lay Catholics discern the difference between spiritual attack and ordinary human struggles like anxiety, depression, or emotional trauma, a distinction he considers crucial, because treating a purely psychological wound as if it were purely spiritual, or a spiritual wound as if it were purely psychological can cause real harm. This is where his teaching becomes deeply pastoral, not just theoretical. He is not simply cataloging demons for entertainment or shock value. He is trying to give suffering people a map, a way to understand what is happening to them, and more importantly, a way toward healing. Central to his teaching is a message of hope, not fear. He often speaks about suffering not as something meaningless, but as something that, when united to God and endured rightly, can actually deepen a person's spiritual life rather than destroy it. He has described how what looks like the worst possible thing happening to a person can, through grace, become the very thing that draws them closer to God. This is a profoundly biblical idea. Think of the book of Job, a righteous man stripped of everything who still refused to curse God and who was ultimately restored beyond what he had before. Think of St. Paul, who spoke of a mysterious thorn in the flesh, a trial he begged God to remove 3 times, only to be told that God's grace was enough, that power is made perfect in weakness. This priest's teaching on deliverance rests on a foundation of trust, the belief that God is never absent from the battle. Even when the battle feels overwhelming, he often emphasizes prayer, the sacraments, and the ordinary means the church has always offered. Confession, the Eucharist, the Rosary, not as symbolic gestures, but as genuine spiritual weapons available to every believer, not just to priests trained in formal exorcism. He has written extensively on these themes in his works with titles like Deliverance and Dominion. The nature of diabolic warfare, which lay out in careful theological detail. How he believes ordinary Catholics can protect themselves and their families spiritually through prayer. Through the sacraments, through returning again and again to the mercy of God rather than relying on fear or superstition. It is worth pausing here to say something honestly and fairly. His teachings are not without controversy. From some voices within the church, including some bishops and fellow Catholics, have raised concerns about certain claims he has made, particularly around mental health, where he has suggested that some conditions traditionally treated with medication might instead be spiritual in origin. Critics worry this could lead vulnerable people away from needed medical care. Others push back strongly, arguing his framework is not meant to replace medicine, but to work alongside it. Discerning carefully which struggles are medical, which are spiritual, and which, as he often insists, are both at once. This is a real and ongoing conversation within the church, and different, sincere believers land in different places on it. We share this not to tear him down, but because true respect means telling the whole story, the light and the tension both, rather than a polished, one-sided version. A man walking so close to darkness for so many decades will always attract disagreement. That, too, is part of what it means to stand on a real battlefield. What remains undeniable is the sheer scale of the hunger his message has met. Millions of people, many with no prior exposure to exorcism ministry, have found themselves drawn to his interviews, lectures and writings hungry for a worldview that takes good and evil seriously, that does not dismiss the spiritual dimension of suffering as primitive or irrelevant. His vision is not simply about exorcism as a rare, dramatic event performed on a handful of tormented souls. His vision is about awakening ordinary believers to the reality of the spiritual life as a whole. The idea that every person, whether they realize it or not, is engaged in a lifelong spiritual formation, being shaped either toward goodness or away from it, one choice at a time. He has spoken about how, in recent years, successive popes have directed dioceses around the world to expand their exorcism ministries, training more priests, taking the spiritual battle more seriously at an institutional level. He sees this not as an isolated trend, but as a response to what he believes is a genuine increase in diabolic activity and influence in the modern world, a world that, in his view, has drifted further from prayer, further from the sacraments, further from the disciplines that historically protected communities spiritually. This is where his teaching becomes less about individual dramatic cases and more about a larger cultural diagnosis. He looks around at rising anxiety, broken families, spiritual emptiness, addiction, despair. And he does not see these simply as social or psychological problems to be solved by policy or therapy alone. He sees them, at least in part, as symptoms of a spiritual crisis, a forgetting of the deeper reality that human beings are not just bodies and minds, but souls made for God and vulnerable to real spiritual harm when that relationship is neglected. His vision, then, is fundamentally a call back to prayer, back to the sacraments, back to the ancient wisdom of the saints, back to seeing suffering not as meaningless noise, but as something that can be endured with dignity and even redeemed. He is, in a real sense, trying to re-enchant a disenchanted world, to help people see that the invisible realm is not superstition, but the deepest layer of reality itself. There is something profoundly moving in this vision when you consider where it comes from. This is a man who, by his own admission, never wanted this role. He did not dream, as a boy fishing in Wyoming rivers, of one day standing before demonic manifestations. And yet here he is, using decades of hard-won scholarship and pastoral experience to try to hand ordinary people a map back to hope. Scripture tells us, "Be sober, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, Seeking someone to devour, Psi 1 Peter 5 and 8, it also tells us immediately after to resist, firm in faith. 3. This is the balance his vision tries to strike, taking the danger seriously without letting fear win. Not paranoia. Thirfer, not obsession with darkness, but sober watchfulness paired with unshakable trust that light has already won the final victory. 3. There is an old teaching in the Christian tradition that God allows trials not to destroy us, but to reveal to us a strength we did not know we had, and to draw us into deeper dependence on Him. 3. This priest's vision echoes that ancient wisdom in a modern voice, reminding a generation raised on convenience and distraction that real strength, real peace, and real freedom are found not by avoiding the battle, but by facing it honestly, armed with prayer, humility, and the sacraments of the church. We began this journey in Casper, Wyoming, with a boy who loved fishing and hunting under wide western skies. Nothing about his beginning looked extraordinary. And that, 3, friends, is the first lesson hidden in this story. God rarely announces His greatest plans with fanfare. He plants seeds quietly in ordinary soil and waits. We watch that boy grow into a serious student of theology and philosophy, earning degree after degree, spending years in disciplined study most people would find exhausting. We watched him ordained as a priest in 1997, then sent not to fame, but to obscure parishes and seminaries across Nebraska and Idaho, teaching, serving, praying year after year, 3, with no indication of what was coming. This is the second lesson. The decades that feel wasted, unnoticed, uneventful, are very often the exact years God is using to build the foundation for something you cannot yet see. Then came the invitation from a bishop, not sought after, not manufactured, simply placed in his path to help train exorcists. From that single invitation grew an entire religious society dedicated to standing on the front lines of a battle most people don't even believe exists anymore. This is the third lesson. God's calling often arrives disguised as someone else's request. It rarely looks like a lightning bolt. It often looks like an ordinary conversation that quietly changes the entire direction of a life. And here is something that deserves to be said clearly, because it is one of the most human, most relatable parts of this entire story. This priest has openly admitted that he never wanted this calling, and that even now, he still does not want it. Let that sink in. That the man millions now look to for wisdom on spiritual warfare did not run toward this path with excitement or ambition. He walked into it reluctantly, the way so many of the saints did before him, trembling, uncertain, but obedient. Isn't that, in the end, the most honest picture of what real faith looks like? Not the confident hero charging fearlessly into battle, chest out, unafraid, but the ordinary, tired, reluctant servant who says yes anyway, not because the task feels good, but because they believe it is what God is asking of them.